very much for such a warm welcome, and it's lovely to stand in front of you because I've been sitting amongst you all. I noticed the room is slightly biased to the right at the moment, which is sort of symbolic of this week somehow in Australian politics. That's right. Yes. As Phil says, your left. That's right. Yeah, that's good. So things are all right. I just want to start by saying what fun it's been being with you all for the last 2 days and listening to you all and being amongst you. And I find it really refreshing, and it reminded me how happy I always am in university settings when people are taking issues seriously and learning together. And also what a fantastic dinner last night, so thank you all very much. Maybe I can thank the Deakin people on our behalf very much for such a great evening last night. And the prize givings and the party afterwards, which I am taking as a reason for why I should be particularly clear and short this morning. And I'll do my best so you can get to the next coffee round. I also want to start by honouring the custodians of the land that we're on, and it's particularly kind of them to have a Brit there, actually. So I'm particularly grateful for that and honour them and acknowledge them. Also, I was struck yesterday when Lan said that she'd started in 1999 and how old that made her. I started in 1983. I started in 1983 when I was, I suppose, incredibly young. At around 22 or something, I can't remember. So there we are. Take heart. And there's always someone older than you, but not much longer, perhaps. So listen, thank you for inviting the ICRC to this conference. It's a real pleasure to be in Australia, to speak at the Centre of Humanitarian Leadership, where Deakin University and Save the Children are really pioneering research and teaching in humanitarian leadership, and we need that. We need a better sense of responsible and effective leadership across the humanitarian sector. And we must cultivate humanitarian leaders who are more about others than about themselves. And that's a challenge for leaders, because the kind of people that tend to become leaders can be quite often quite about themselves. And that is important, that we cultivate leaders who are about others. Our conference in these last 2 days has been looking at the future. And it's been focusing on 3 major challenges for humanitarian leadership: a shifting global system, climate change, and localization. So I want to try and examine each of these 3 areas by looking at them as 3 very big things that demand our attention to some very important little things if humanitarian action is to rise and meet these challenges. So big things and little things. We all live our lives between big things and little things. Every builder will tell you that the beautiful large house you see before you may look like one big building, but is, of course, made up of many little bricks. And all of you who are academics, who hold up your fabulous, finely bound PhD thesis at the end of your period of scholarship, will present it as a fine, big, single thing, but you will know only too well the detail of the hundreds of footnotes at the back of your thesis and the particular agony of their compilation during the process of writing up. Our discovery of the universe as human beings is marked by our simultaneous appreciation of things that are enormous, like galaxies, and newly visible black holes, and our equal amazement at things that are truly miniature, the nano world of particles and subatomic particles, which determine so much about the world around us. And this all makes for a distinction between great objects and the smaller materials that construct them. And so it's in humanitarian action, it's the same, where there are important big things and important little things, great strategic objectives that we have, and the organizational material that we need to bring them about. A humanitarian leader must understand and attend to both. if she or he is going to succeed. This ability to handle both scale and detail is a consistent feature of good leaders throughout history. Good leadership is also marked by a person who can give his or her people 4 important ingredients. And I know I'm going against the 6, whatever they were, that we couldn't remember last night at dinner. But I'm going to just take a different take on that. A good leader has to give his or her people 4 important ingredients, which will enable them to succeed. Vision, explanation, equipment, and encouragement. A good leader gives a clear vision that sets out a direction or a challenge, which must ring true as a noble, relevant, and morally important challenge for their organization. A vision must motivate and inspire. Secondly, a good leader must then reasonably explain why this vision is feasible, why it's not out of reach, but can be achieved by the organization. A leader's explanation must also give people a clear sense of how each one of them has a part to play. And the third thing a good leader then also gives their people is equipment, power, knowledge, skills, and resources to rise to the challenge and achieve the objectives. And finally, a good leader then encourages people as they struggle, fail, and succeed. And that last point is really important, encouragement. So humanitarian leadership around our 3 conference challenges of global system shifts, climate change, and localization must offer these vital forms of leadership. And that is the challenge for all of you as actual or potential humanitarian leaders. I now want to look at our 3 focus areas of the conference and reflect on how each one requires good leadership that's both big and small. So if I think of our first challenge, leading in a shifting global system. The global political system is changing. We cannot be sure exactly how it is changing and how it will play out. But some things are already clear and relevant to humanitarians. First, we are in a multipolar world where China, India, and many middle powers have truly broken free of the legacy of colonialism and marginalization to take their rightful place as peers or near peers to the US, Russia, and Europe. This is exciting. It is surely more just that power and resources should be equally spread, and that global culture should be more diverse, more colourful in every sense, and less dominated by one group. But this multipolarity is also alarming, because it may take shape as contest, not cooperation. And it does contain, like all great power moments, the seeds of great power conflict and a long-range risk of global war. That's one thing we can see coming through the list. The second thing is it's clear that great powers and their people will challenge the current global aid regime, or just ignore it, as they make competing regimes of their own. Asian tigers did it without aid, and think that the OECD aid model has failed because they did it on their own, and elsewhere poverty still exists. I hear this argument a lot when I meet Chinese people and people from India and other places. The Western humanitarian system has achieved many truly great things, and it has saved many lives. But many of its little things, its feeling of invasion, its attitudes of superiority, its risks of dependency, and its Western hold on humanitarian power, has caused resentment in some communities and some key quarters of the political class of many countries. Important states and influential people think there is a better way than the Western way. China, India, and many countries are pursuing a South-South model of cooperation with billions of dollars. This is largely an economy-first model that puts only very marginal emphasis on humanitarian action. Thirdly, the world seems to be moving away from liberalism towards radical conservatism and increasing authoritarianism. We've discussed that already. And this is a pendulum swing away from the liberal consensus and liberal hegemony of the 1990s and 2000s. This conservative and nationalist swing is happening in the heartlands of Europe and the USA. And today's European elections will be important to listen to. And here, many people have had enough of liberal internationalism and are saying simply, more about us, less about them. And like the New Asian way, Western conservatism is also critical of the Western aid regime. Many conservatives are impatient with fat aid bureaucracies and multilateral institutions that are always asking for more money. Conservatives resent apparent virtue signalling of people who make lucrative careers out of poverty and fly business class while reading reports of human suffering. They despise the overreach of a liberal human rights project obsessed, in their view, with terrorist rights, sexual identity, and distant dictators, when they feel their own socio-economic rights are overlooked. So how should humanitarian leadership respond to these three global systems shifts? Leading big on this challenge means setting and explaining a vision for how the Western humanitarian system and its organizations should respond to these changes. It means deciding how much of the Western system needs to be actively preserved as essential, and how much that system can lean into and change with emerging alternative systems. For the ICRC, there are three key parts of the existing system which must be held firm, and they will not surprise you. These are IHL, principled humanitarian action, and the individualized approach to suffering, which engages carefully with individual human beings and not just large-scale collectivist economic aid. Those three things, we think, are profoundly, universally, and eternally precious. I'm not sure if ICRC's talked about eternity before. No doubt we should do so immediately and have a policy. Here, humanitarian leaders must be ready to make a big and respectful stand and actively influence alternative systems as they emerge, so that these systems appreciate, accommodate, and support humanitarian norms and humanitarian actions. But in other areas, humanitarian leaders must be ready to lean into the new aid systems and be changed by them. We need to appreciate the critique of Western aid models and be ready to adapt to models of South-South cooperation and explore how best to support humanitarian action along the Chinese government's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, when it is needed. We need to connect with conservatism and authoritarianism and make a new humanitarian contract with their values and convictions that overlap with humanity and value life, family, and community. We have probably become too accustomed to our contract with liberal internationalism and its project of progressive human rights. This humanitarian contract was becoming second nature, but now the political weather is changing. We must strike a new humanitarian deal with the conservative West and establish a humanitarian win-win with China. Humanitarianism has no party politics. It must engage all political movements to achieve humanitarian objectives and remind all politics of humanitarian norms and humanitarian law. So if this is the big vision, to stand firm on core practice and lean into new political systems, then what are the little things, the organizational detail that are needed to make this possible? What equipment do we need to deliver this vision? I think relationships are the first little thing. If our humanitarian organizations are to be relevant globally, then we must make new relationships with policymakers, educators, and practitioners across Asia Pacific in particular. And that's why you as a group are so important. Knowledge is the second little thing. We must stop being mesmerized by our own Western philosophy, our Western donors, and our Western ways, and open up our thinking so we can join new discussions. Being ready to change is the third little thing. People will only really have a true conversation with Western humanitarians if we are clearly ready to be influenced by them and have a real conversation and adapt around their power and model. We must then be ready to change the way we work, probably profoundly. Conviction and evidence is another small thing we will need in this process. We need to stand firm on IHL principles and the importance of the individual, and have evidence to show how our approach adds real value to any new system. Each one of these things are, of course, very difficult to do, but they need to take place at the atomic level of our organizations, the DNA level, which is why they can legitimately be called small, even if they are also legitimately difficult. They are indeed the detail made famous by the devil. All of you here in Asia Pacific are well aware of these shifts. You are already leading down this road. And I'm only telling you what you know already. But back in Europe and the US, some of us humanitarians can still live for weeks at a time without realizing the world has changed. So the second thing I want to look at is the climate crisis, leading in an era of climate crisis, which is the second issue of our conference. And again, people in Asia Pacific have also been the first to feel our new era of climate crisis. So here too, I'm in danger of telling you what you know. The process of developing our new institutional strategy at the ICRC last year saw consistent alarm bells ringing about people who are living with conflict and climate crisis simultaneously. We now refer to this as a double vulnerability, which millions of people experience who are living through conflict shocks and climate shocks simultaneously or sequentially. In places like Mali, Somalia, Myanmar, Afghanistan, or the Philippines. Our strategy consultations last year have been followed by urgent operational research and regional roundtables this year that are looking at people's experience of climate, conflict, and resilience. We have to catch up in the ICRC, and we're trying to do that this year and build our own policy on conflict and climate. It's clear to us already that serious and relevant engagement with people experiencing this double vulnerability over extended periods of time is crucial to us. Our strategy already recognized that we need to find new ways of achieving what we're calling sustainable humanitarian impact in our new strategy. And some people have been surprised to see the ICRC focusing in one major objective on sustainable humanitarian impact. And this is important when people face climate crisis and protracted conflict for years. And our research is already telling us four things. It's telling us that simply replacing assets and repairing livelihoods is no longer sufficient in places where these assets and livelihoods are no longer feasible. Instead, we need to help people mitigate and adapt as part of a humanitarian response in conflict. Secondly, our research is telling us that millions of people are already living at the very limits of adaptation, so that adaptation within their environment is not even possible anymore. And thirdly, that climate finance could help this kind of adaptive humanitarian action, but conflict-affected countries are the least eligible for climate finance as it is currently structured. And finally, the fourth thing our research is telling us is that we in the ICRC have a lot to learn about disaster risk reduction, mitigation, and adaptation from our more expert colleagues in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, like the Federation, like the Australian Red Cross, and other national societies in Asia Pacific, and we need to learn it fast. And not everyone is convinced about all this, of course. Many people are understandably wondering if the ICRC is becoming a climate agency or starting to do sustainable development. We are, of course, becoming neither of these things. We are simply trying to work out what it means to do humanitarian action in an era of chronic climate crisis. So what are the challenges for humanitarian leadership here? Leading big on this one means setting a vision that's clearly relevant, humanitarian, and well understood. At the ICRC, this involves saying clearly that our humanitarian work needs to adapt to adaptation. This is becoming a bit of a strapline for us. Our humanitarian work needs to adapt to adaptation and take that on board. If our protection and assistance is to be relevant to people living with the compounded problems of conflict and climate crisis, somehow we need to help today's war-affected populations become the Venetians of our age. And I hope you'll now forgive me if I just do a little condenser about Venice from my talk. Venice, like Abruzzo, is in Italy. And Venice is a city founded and developed in the 5th century AD by thousands of IDPs, fleeing continuous military attack over years and invasion by Germanic tribes, them again, into northern Italy. These IDPs fled down and were forced to flee from their stable, rural, urban and arable lives in the rich farming lands of northern Italy into the marshy swamps of the Adriatic, where they took refuge on many reed-covered islands of the Venetian lagoon, not unlike thousands of people in South Sudan today hiding in those reedy, boggy, swampy areas. Here, these IDPs were forced to adapt and build a new life that accepted water as their new environment. Instead of farmhouses, horses and carts, these war-affected IDPs built on stilts, took to boats and accommodated floods. They became one of the greatest aquatic societies the world has ever known. And I was reminded of this when Per showed us that UNHCR jolly music propaganda video about people in refugee camp, but there were lovely stories in it, and there were lovely statements by an elder saying, I want this camp to be one of the great cities. And I thought that was Venice. That's what happened in Venice. The aquatic way of life is also known to millions in the deltas and seashores of Asia Pacific, and this Asian Venetian commitment to adaptation offers a role model for humanitarian organizations today. This leadership vision of adaptation stands firm on the need for urgent humanitarian action that saves lives and helps people to stay alive by supporting their efforts to move on to new pathways of adaptation and resilience that include mitigation wherever possible. So if this Venetian vision of adaptive humanitarian action is leading big, then what is leading small on climate crisis? What is the equipment we need to do this well? Once again, the small things at the atomic level of the organization are the accumulation of new knowledge and new relationships, and that vital trait of changeability the ability to change, needed to develop new forms of practice in new kinds of environment. All ICRC operational staff will need to think climate and do climate in a way that has not been the case to date. Our monitoring of conflict must increasingly be coupled with the monitoring of climate and environmental change. Our protection and assistance work will have to take up sustainability as an important objective. An improvement to our own green footprint will require significant changes in our organizational habits. This operational and organizational detail will require deep leadership across many small parts of the organization. So that's leading big and small on climate crisis. And our third theme for the conference, of course, is localization. And here, our humanitarian leadership must be counterintuitive. We must not lead in localization. Localization is ethically right, and the power shift it requires is one of justice and respect. And I agree with so many things that Degan Ali has said in her opening keynote. And her fundamental call for the decolonization of aid is profoundly important and deeply humane. But I don't agree with everything she says. And I would in fact value the chance to debate with Degan in public one day. Maybe we should try and do that, but probably I have to leave ICRC first. I think we must go beneath the headlines of localization and think through its risks and opportunities for people in more detail. In particular, I think the basic good of localization requires the important qualification of complementarity, and that there is sometimes a necessity for international action and support. And I don't think this because I'm white. I think it because the war is an especially challenging context for humanity and has certain laws and practices that are agreed by all states. States have agreed that impartial organizations like the ICRC can offer their services to all parties to conflict. Armed conflict creates conditions which make it extremely difficult for warring parties to trust one another and cooperate on humanitarian problems. This sometimes creates a need for a neutral third party to cross the lines of conflict, to meet the legally agreed needs of people on all sides, and to operate transparently between all sides. Sometimes this role can be played by trusted national and local actors, but at other times the warring parties are grateful for the services of the ICRC and other international humanitarian organizations. So this is the international complementarity of impartiality. It's impartiality support in protection and assistance. But there's also the important complementarity of resources and expertise, which Ramwati Hussain, where's Ramwati? Oh, you're here, great. Explained very well in her excellent presentation on Indonesia. Sometimes local actors do not have enough of what they need. And here, a complementarity of resources, expertise, and perhaps encouragement must be enacted in the service of humanity. Justice demands that if resources are available and the method of their application will not breach the wider good of localization, then they should be shared in a spirit of solidarity, not power. So if you can offer support without breaching the basic rule of localization, then you must offer that support. Beyond arguments of necessity for international complementarity, there are ethical demands on localization itself. Humanity demands a localization of effective humanitarian response. It would be wrong to praise an operation if it were perfectly local but profoundly ineffective. It's not enough for localizers to say simply that we are better than neo-colonial international actors because we enable the basic good of self-determination. Local and national action must not only be self-determined, it must be effective as humanitarian action and live up to the standard of humanity. Humanity also demands a localization of non-discrimination. For example, Lan Mercado's presentation yesterday reminded us that we must beware of simplistic localization that hands over humanitarian action to patriarchal local structures who overlook women and girls, and whose power and perspective is as flawed as neo-colonial aid. Corruption. Corruption is often the elephant in the room of localization discussions. But it seems to me to be a moot point in localization ethics. We can legitimately talk of corruption in many conflict and disaster-affected societies. But I think we can also legitimately speak of corruption in an international humanitarian system that employs too many people, flies them business class, and pays tax-free salaries close to those of corporate lawyers. So again, what are the leadership challenges for humanitarian organizations in localization, both international and local? Big leading on localization means setting up a clear joint vision of a simultaneously stepping back and a simultaneous stepping up. International organizations lead by stepping back, and national organizations lead by stepping up. This is the vision, and it can be explained as ethically right and operationally sustainable. And what about leading on the little things, the details of localization? A power shift requires a difficult mindset change across international and local organizations. The attitudes of centuries are ingrained subatomically in people's minds, habits and practices. Detox will be troubling and take time. And then there is deep systems change in international and national organizations. International organizations will need to change their structures and their modus operandi, just as Australian Red Cross are doing this so well and reconfiguring their humanitarian business model to partnership and brokerage right now. These new structures will prioritize new skills and deprioritize current skills as international staff move from being managers and operators to investors and advisors. International organizations will have to establish a relationship of cooperation, not control. National and local organizations will need to become autonomous, liberated, and in power, responsibly in power. There will still be an important need for working together in partnerships, which will require investments of time and money as new modus operandi are discovered and honed. And it's here, in shaping new partnerships, that the detail of complementarity must be worked out. Where are the gaps in impartiality, resources, and expertise, and how can they be covered? These atomic relational changes will require courage from government donors, INGOs, and local organizations, working respectfully as backers, brokers, and builders. Solidarity and patience will be key in maintaining commitment and momentum, and in dealing with the shock of change, and with failure and scandal when they inevitably arise alongside success. So to finish, our conference themes have focused on, and they've focused well on, the deep challenges to humanitarian action in a new era of global power, a new era of climate crisis, and a new era of localization. And I hope my thoughts have been a little useful. But I suspect, frankly, that I have learned far more from you here in Asia Pacific in the last couple of days than you have just learned from me. Thank you.